It's one of my favorite stories, and it changes. Not so much my story, but what has been happening recently and what has been happening to the story recently. 1981, as I said, I was invited to Japan, met Mr. Kakehashi again, and the engineer that designed the Jupiter 8. And Mr. Kakehashi was very keen on creating a connection between one of our sequences and the Jupiter 8. He and an engineer called Mr. Sakai had created this connection. It was a serial connection, and they were referring to it as a universal serial bus, which I thought these days I think it's hilarious because of USB. But eventually changed it after some discussions. Now they had discussions with Dave Smith from Sequential Circuits and Tom Oberheim from Oberheim Keyboards. The three gentlemen agreed on the possibility of starting a standard that every manufacturer would use. And Taro was telling me this, and I said to him at the time, "Are you sure you want to give part of our technology away to another company?" And Taro's reasoning was that it was a small music business at the time, and it wasn't going to grow unless everybody started working together. And nobody was really going to make financial success if they didn't start working together. For example, Prophet had a sequencer, but they had a sequencer inside their keyboard. Roland had sequencers outside the keyboard. But it was clearly going to be the case very soon. Prophet would have an external sequencer. Now, what if somebody bought the Prophet sequencer and loved it, but didn't like the Prophet keyboard? They were stuck with it. So it made sense to create Midi. After those three gentlemen got together, Dave Smith announced at the AES in 1982 that he wanted to create a system and that everybody should get on board. And apparently they had huge arguments between everybody because Tom Oberheim, for example, wanted a parallel bus so that would be faster. Somebody wanted a really, really heavy cable to connect and so on, so that it would carry more data and be more solid and so on. So the arguments just went on and on. And it wasn't until 1982 at NAMM where Dave Smith got up and said, "Look, I've got an idea. I'm going to call it the Universal Serial Interface." Synthesizer interface, I think, USI. At which time, Roland were already releasing our USB, although by this stage we called it the DCB, the Digital Control Bus. And so we already had this thing, but we couldn't still get the agreement. Dave, to his credit, went around to everybody again and said, "Look, you've got to get aboard to Yamaha, to Sequential, to Oberheim." Kakehashi was involved in all of this at the time. And eventually it came down to that small group that did agree to it, saying, well, we're the major players in a small market. If we do it, they'll have to go along with it. So it wasn't really ready. And then it was to be released in the 1983 NAMM, the new products. And we were going to get together and say, here it is, this is Midi. Except Mr. Dave Smith released his in December. I always thought it was a little bit strange. And I mentioned that to Taro Kakehashi at one stage, what do you think about that? Because it wasn't the agreement to come out to NAMM. And Taro said, oh, history will tell. He's very laid back in that way. And that's the interesting thing now, because now it is coming out that way. If you look at Wiki, and of course you can believe everything it says, but it's for years has been saying Dave Smith, the founder or creator of Midi. Lately, it's been saying he announced the possibility of a serial interface after consultation with Mr. Kakehashi and Tom Oberheim. So clearly things have changed. And David and Kakehashi got a technical Grammy for Midi. So my personal connection, yes, I met Mr. Sakai, who wrote the spec. But my favorite story about that time was I was with Mr. Kakehashi in Japan, in Hamamatsu, and he said, let's go out for lunch. And we went to one of his favorite restaurants, and suddenly there's Dave Smith arrived at the restaurant. And I thought, that's a bit weird. But they're discussing Midi, and the whole lunch conversation was about the connector. What are we going to use for the connector? For example, Tom Oberheim, like I said, wanted to use a parallel interface, which meant a really big, huge chunky plug and cable. It also had huge grounding problems, so you had noise going all the time. I'm not sure what exact connector Dave Smith wanted, but it was 2-pin and had the same grounding problems. So then until Roland Japan came along and said, look, we've got an idea, we'll use opto-isolators so they're not actually connecting, we're just seeing the digital signals, that allowed more than one instrument to be connected. With everybody else's design, it was going to be 2 only, because if you put another one in there, you would get ground loops, and it was just untenable. So we ended up with this Midi plug, and the amount of complaints about Midi, oh, it's too slow, it's serial, so you play a chord, every note's going to be later than the other one, and you're using that damn Midi plug that the guitarist is going to kick out for sure halfway through the note. And it's 30 years old now, and there's very little chance of changing it that much. I think Mr. K should be really, really proud.